So I want to start today by asking a question. Have you ever met somebody who has a kind of against all odds faith? They're in a really tough spot. They have difficulties in their life, struggles, maybe even somebody, maybe it's you during this COVID kind of crisis that we're in. They're the kind of person that has this odd calming life about them. They don't deny the difficulties that they're going in, so they're not, or that they're in, they're not in denial, but yet they don't seem to be weighted by them. They don't just have that tough guy kind of approach. No, that didn't hurt, because they're honest about the pain and the difficulty that's there. But somehow underneath that whole reality of what they face, there's a peaceful calm and there's a confidence in God that's undeniable. They don't use Christianese words to describe it. There's just this remarkable peace and even joy in the middle of difficulties. Now, if you've ever met someone like that, that person has probably formed your faith. It could be, in fact, that you came to faith in Jesus because of somebody like that. They leave that kind of mark in our lives. You know them when you see them. I've had somebody like that in my life. That's my friend Daniel Perkins. I met Daniel about 8 years ago when he and his family of a dozen kids showed up in a 15-passenger van at Copper Hills, and that in itself would create some interest and curiosity about the person. And for some reason, Daniel and I hit it off and had this wonderful friendship and chemistry. And shortly after, I met him the first time we went for lunch together. And I asked him about his story, what his faith background was and how do you end up with 12 kids and that kind of thing. And he said, I grew up in a secular humanist environment, and that's who I was through like the majority of my adult life. And if you don't know what a secular humanist would be or what they believe, they actually don't believe in a divine being. They would think that science and logic and reason would have the answers to the dilemmas of life, and you actually learn those as you live life. Life teaches you. There isn't a sense of afterlife, there's life after death. There's no sense of that. And this is kind of just how Daniel had been raised and how he thought and how he processed his life. But someplace along the way, that stopped being enough for Daniel. He was a thinker and he was curious and interested, and somehow the well just ran dry on his secular humanism. And he did what Daniel does. He went for a search for truth. And there's more to the story, but eventually he has his focus turned to God, and he meets Jesus in that kind of personal way, the way people do, and he placed his trust in Jesus and relied on him for his life and for his eternity. Well, I met Daniel after that experience. Shortly after I met Daniel 7 years ago, he was diagnosed with a really tricky and difficult cancer. The kind of cancer that, statistics were that only 7% of people who get this cancer survive more than 5 years. Well, Daniel's battle with that cancer ended 2 weeks ago. I went to see him 4 days before he passed away on a Saturday afternoon, and we had the most wonderful time together. He was bright and alert, and he was feeling strong, and he was feeling good, and we sat and watched the Diamondbacks, repeat of Diamondbacks' 2001 World Series victory. It was just as sweet, by the way, that Saturday as it was the first time around. It's always good when the Yankees lose. And we just had a great time thinking about and reminiscing about where we were when that World Series was won, and talked about baseball, and then the conversation evolved to other things, and we were just talking as good friends talk. And at one point, because Daniel and I had this kind of friendship, I said, Daniel, before too long, we'll probably do a memorial service for you. And I'm wondering what you would want to say or what you would want to have happen at that. And he looked at me and he smiled. He says, yeah, I guess I should think about that, shouldn't I? And so we talked together. But it was interesting when he talked about his memorial service and he thought about songs. It was like for him picking songs off Spotify. It was just kind of a natural thing, or thinking about what he wanted to have happen at his memorial service. It was often in a way like planning for a vacation. When we talked about heaven and what he would experience, it was like thinking ahead to the greatest vacation he would ever have. And this was Daniel. And He left this inspirational, remarkable impression on my life of someone who doesn't deny the struggles or the difficulties, but somehow has this quiet, gentle, real, honest to goodness trust in Jesus Christ. It's remarkable. And if you've ever met someone like that, you know that that is the impact they leave. Well, the reason I tell you all this is that what Daniel was sharing with me was his own personal eyewitness account of his walk and his journey with Jesus. And you'll notice the series is called Eyewitness, and we've been looking at people who were on the ground with Jesus that first century. Guys like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John in particular, as they lived life with Jesus and lived alongside him and shared the experiences of what it was like to live with Jesus and what that did for them and what that did for their faith. Well, it appears that John outlives all of his peers, and when he gets to be an old man, it's like he gets to the end of his life and he writes some experiences that he really wants to pass on to people. I think, recently I've mentioned my dad passed away, and a couple of years ago, my sister and my dad sat down and he wrote a bit of a chronology of his life. And, why did he do that? Because he wanted to capture the story? I think there's something more. I think he wanted to pass something on to his children and his grandchildren. And maybe that's like John. He gets to the end of his life as an old man, and we read in one of the letters that he writes in 1 John, this is what we read. It says, "We proclaim to you the one who existed from the beginning, who we have heard." Like John had heard him. He had actually heard his voice. We've seen him. We saw him with our own eyes, and we touched him with our own hands. He is the word of life. The one who is life itself was revealed to us, and we have seen him. And now we testify and proclaim to you that he is the one who is eternal life. He was with the Father, and then he was revealed to us. Like he was right with us. We proclaim to you that we ourselves have actually seen and heard, so that you may have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. In other words, what John is saying, his encounter with Jesus, he was with him, he heard him, he had meals with him, and they were together. And that created a fellowship, a oneness, a friendship, an intimacy with Jesus. And he's saying, we want you to have that too. So let me tell you about what I experienced so that you'll experience that too. I don't want you to miss out on it. I really want you to have this. So it's like someone comes to John and it says, John, like you have so much wisdom and there's so much of an experience that you have with Jesus. Why don't you write down those accounts? Why don't you write down what actually happened? And here John is at an old age. He begins to write down what he actually experienced with Jesus, his eyewitness account. More than likely, he dictated it to someone because he was old and probably didn't write it himself. But in any event, what we learn from it is that it is really important to get these eyewitness accounts, to get a sense of what people actually thought, felt, experienced with Jesus. And so John writes it down, but we don't really know exactly why he does it, why it's so important, till he gets almost through his story and almost like he catches his breath and he goes, oh, by the way, I want to tell you, as he says in John 19:35, this report is from an eyewitness giving an account, an accurate account. He, that's me, speaks the truth. Why? So that you'll also to continue to believe. Tells a little bit more of the story, gets to the crucifixion story, and he stops again and he says this a few verses later. He says, but these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you'll have life by the power of his name. John isn't just telling these to record events. He's telling us so that we'll believe and we'll respond the way that he did. So we picked up a few of John's stories. I want to pick up another one today. Let's pick up the account here. It's early in Jesus' public ministry, and Jesus and his gang of 12 have gone down to Jerusalem for the annual Passover festival. It was the large Passover festival that everybody in the nation would come to every once a year, and Jesus has done that. He gets into Jerusalem, and apparently some amazing thing happens. We don't know exactly what it was, but Jesus did a series of miracles that are recorded. John simply records it this way: because of the miraculous signs Jesus did in Jerusalem at the Passover celebration, many began to trust him. Well, we don't know what those were. But he had a reputation for healing people. He had a reputation for casting demons out of people, releasing people from bondage and difficulties. And we do know on that particular trip, he kind of turned over the deal in the temple, driving out money changers and business people who were kind of corrupt and doing things that would defile God's house. So he does that. And at the end of that, he decides he's going to go back home to Nazareth, to the northern part of the country. And this is where John picks up this particular eyewitness account of an incident I want to share with you. In John 4:46, it says, as Jesus traveled through Galilee, he came to Cana, where he had turned water into wine. There was a government official in nearby Capernaum whose son was very sick. A couple of things. You might recognize Cana. That's where he turned water into wine. How smart do you have to be to know how to change the molecular structure of water into wine? It's pretty smart. He knew how to do that. That's amazing. And it says, a man from Capernaum came to see Jesus. Well, Capernaum was down the hill about 20 miles to the east of where Cana was, on the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. It would be about a 2 to 3 hour horseback ride, I suppose, to get to Cana, something like that. We also know this about him. We know that he was a government official. And why would that be important? Well, it's important to note that his boss would have been Herod Antipas, who was Herod the Great's son. Well, why does that matter? Well, Herod the Great and his son Antipas were not fans of Jesus at all. In fact, Herod Antipas would be the one that would behead John the Baptist. He would be directly involved in the capture, the crucifixion of Jesus, the sentence of Jesus. So he knew who Jesus was, and he was not a fan. And this man, whose name we don't know, worked for him. He was part of his cabinet, possibly, or had some responsibility. So the reason that's important is it would be a bit odd for someone who was opposed to Jesus, or worked for someone who was strongly opposed to Jesus, to come and see him and ask for help. But today, this man doesn't care. He doesn't care that he's a government official. He doesn't seem to care what his boss thinks. He's got something. He's a desperate man, and desperate times call for desperate measures. You see, on this particular occasion, he's a dad with a son who's desperately, critically ill. And he is going to do what dads do. He is going to do whatever he can to get whatever help he can get for his son. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter where it is. He's like us dads. We love our kids. And is there any limit that we would go to if our child was deathly ill that we wouldn't go to try to help and find a solution for that? I think several years ago, like 20 or so years ago, Elfie and I were visiting family in another country. And we had left our kids for the week with various friends. And a couple of days into our visit to this country, we got a phone call from the dad of the friend that one of my sons was staying at. And he's kind of breathless on the phone. And he says, I don't know how to tell you this, but your son's had a seizure. Well, you hear that for the first time, and like all the alarm bells go off, and we want to get information. How is he? What's happening? The first thing I can think of is, let's get on the phone. Let's call the airline. Let's get home. Let's find an airplane that's going to take us home the quickest possible way. I don't care what it costs. I don't care what we're getting home to look after our son. We love him. When I think about that experience, I think that's a little bit what this government official might have felt when he thought about his son and where he was at. So I can kind of relate. Doesn't matter. We're going to go get help for my son. Now, why would he pick Jesus? Why would that be the option? Well, evidently, he hears that Jesus has returned from Jerusalem, and it's possible that because Passover was such a national festival, he had been to Jerusalem. Maybe he had seen what Jesus had done. Possibly not. Maybe what it was is he heard from people who had been there, and they had seen what Jesus had done in Jerusalem, the people that he had healed, and he heard stories. And all it took for him is to hear those stories that someone else had said what Jesus had done and go, I'm going to take care of this. I am going to go find Jesus, and I'm going to get help from him. And this is how John records it. In verse 47, he says, when he heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went and he begged Jesus to come to Capernaum to heal his son, who was about to die. He doesn't send a messenger. He goes himself. This is too important. He's going to go himself. Can you imagine the conversation between him and his wife? He says, I'm going to go get Jesus and bring him back here. And I wonder if his wife wasn't somewhat concerned about his future employment, given his boss didn't really care for Jesus all that much. But I think he just says, no, I'm going to go. I have to go. I have to go do this, and I have to go now. I'm going to drop whatever it is, and I'm going to go. I don't care what happens. I'm going. So in desperation, he goes to Jesus. This is what desperation does. It overcomes apprehension. And he saddles up his horse and he races off to Cana. He finds Jesus, and there we're told that he begs Jesus. Now, socially, Jesus was underneath this man by a long shot. He had power, he had authority. Jesus was this carpenter, this itinerant teacher. There's quite a contrast in social strata. But to him, it doesn't matter, apparently. Theology doesn't matter. Dignity doesn't matter. Propriety doesn't matter. He needs something, and he's going to ask Jesus. Have you ever prayed those kinds of prayers of desperation? I don't know, God, if you exist, but I need you. I have to have your intervention on this. I have no place else to turn. If you're there, and I don't know if you are, would you help me? Would you help me in this time? I need you, God. Well, if you've ever been desperate enough, you know that you'll take whatever chance or option that you have to possibly make the situation better, and this is what he does, and he begs Jesus. And Jesus, of course, responds. But you know, at first glance, when you see what Jesus says, you think, well, wow, that's a really insensitive response. Why would you say that to him? Well, you see, it's less what Jesus says, it's more a problem with our English interpretation or translation of what he says. This is what he says. It says, Jesus asked, will you never believe in me unless you see miraculous signs and wonders? And it does sound kind of direct and maybe even rude, but you have to understand the way it's written. He's not speaking directly to this man. It's written in the plural. He's speaking to everybody that's there. And really what he's saying is he says, I know something about human nature. It's this kind of tone. I know this. There's an idiom that you kind of live by, and I know it's a real thing. And here's the idiom. Seeing is believing. To really believe something, you have to see it. Seeing is believing. I know that in the mind of the rational, post-enlightenment human being, Jesus might say, the only way that you're really going to believe something is if you see it. Jesus is so culturally savvy and so aware of what the human nature is that rather than beat the guy up or shame the people around him who are listening to him, he just recognizes that this is just the reality of us as human beings. You see, we need to see something before we'll believe something. And Jesus is just humble enough and gracious enough to go, I'm not going to let that sit. I'm going to do something here that's going to be maybe a new twist on that idea, that maybe seeing isn't the only way to believe. Jesus is aware of this. We see it in that he comes to earth. He's God, but he comes to earth to show us who he is. He says at one point, if you want to see who the Father is, you want to see God, you look at me, because if you see me, you've seen him. Jesus is profoundly aware of the human nature to want to see before we believe. So Jesus decides to give them something so wonderful to see that people will be talking about it for thousands of years, just like we are right now. Jesus would reveal that he knows that there's a type of believing that is not seeing. It's believing through hearing what other people have seen. And that's a different kind of basis for belief. It seems the dad doesn't really even listen to the comment about you won't believe if you don't see, because he just presses on. In verse 49, it says the official pleaded again. He really wants something. Lord, please come now before my little boy dies. Jesus, please. I suppose I'm powerful enough I could just take you. I could force you to come with me. I have higher social standing than you, and I don't even care if I embarrass myself in front of my guys, but I'm begging you. I'm pleading with you if you'll come with me. I know that you can do something for my son, but I don't know it because I've seen you do it. I know you can do it because I heard someone else saw you do something like that. So my faith is not based on seeing. My request is not based on what I have seen you do. My faith in asking you this is based on what others have said about you and what they have experienced. Jesus, I have nothing to lose. I got two options. You either come with me and my son lives, or you don't come with me and my son dies. To which Jesus maybe looks at it and goes, well, there's a third option. There is a third option. Jesus asks this dad to do what he asks each one of us to do every day. How about if you trust me based on what others have heard about me and have experienced in me? What if you trust me based on stories of others that they have told in their experiences with me? Verse 50 says, then Jesus told him, go back home, your son will live. Why don't you trust me enough just to go back without me? The word go that's used here is really interesting. The tone that's used is really saying that he isn't saying go, hurry back. It's actually a slow go. It's, hey, why don't you go back on your horse and meander down the trail back down to the Sea of Galilee. No rush. Don't worry. It's all going to be okay. You don't have to hurry home. There's no panic. You don't have to be afraid anymore. You just can slowly go without any hurry. That's what the word go in this context means. I'm going to ask you to go home and trust me that the things you've heard about me are actually true. And this is also where we live every day. We're asked every day to entrust our well-being, our health, our finances, our jobs, protection, provision, our lives to Jesus. Even our eternity based on the accounts of eyewitnesses of people who saw and heard and were with Jesus. That's what we're banking on. We're asked to go about our daily lives that seem so fragile and uncertain, even scary. We feel imprisoned, we're quarantined. And we're asked to be confident and to be content that there is something about Jesus that transcends all of this life, to live lives of peace and tranquility and joy because someone else saw, heard, was with him and experienced that by being with him. We're expected to hear those stories, read those stories, and for those to penetrate our hearts and penetrate our lives. No wonder when we see someone who does this and lives like that, they are starkly unusual in our world. They're oddly inspiring and we're drawn to them. Sometimes we're skeptical and we push back because it couldn't possibly be real. This is what it means for us that when we pray and we hear silence, when there are difficulties that won't abate, loss that seems unfathomable, that we have solid reason based on what others have seen and heard and experienced to continue to trust Jesus, that we can remain faithful. We can allow joy to reign in us. We can keep walking forward without hurry and without worry. By the way, do you know who's watching you when you do that? No, you don't. Do you know who's asking questions about if Jesus is real in a time like this and they're learning from you? Probably not. Do you know who's struggling to believe and desperately needs to see someone who does? No. You live next to them. You do life with them. They live in the valley that we gather as a church. You work alongside them. Your kids play sports with them. These are the people that long to see a real model, a legit example of what faith and trust and contentment and abiding and resting in Jesus really looks like. And the thing is, their faith is impacted by the story you tell. They won't maybe see Jesus right then, but you have, and your story is what will inspire their faith. It's people who live in the homes around us, work alongside us, people that we need to notice and take interest in and let them see a faith that comes because of our experience with Jesus. Jesus said to the most unlikely people of his day, before he had even fully revealed to them who he was with lots of miracles and those kinds of things, that if they would have a resting faith in him, they would be like a city on a hill. They'd be like a light in the darkness. And that's who we are invited to be. So, what does the dad do in the story, right? What's he going to do? Well, what he does next changes the rest of his life and the lives of his entire family. This is what we read. And the man believed what Jesus said, and he started home. He believes and behaves as if what Jesus has said could really be trusted. Goes on, while the man was on his way, some of his servants met him with the news that his son was alive and well. He asked them when the boy had begun to get better, and they replied, yesterday afternoon at 1 o'clock, his fever suddenly left him. Then the father realized that this was the very time that Jesus had told him, your son will live. And he, his entire household, believed in Jesus. Of course they did, right? Because seeing is believing, right? This man actually believed before he saw. It could be argued he saw because he believed. What about us? You know, John actually tells us about this believing without seeing kind of faith. And believe it or not, it's even a better faith than seeing in believing faith. Here's what I mean. Shortly after Jesus' resurrection, one of his friends, Thomas, and I just say the word and doubt comes to your mind because that's what he's known for. He says, I'm not going to believe unless I see Jesus. Unless I see the nail prints and I see his side, I am not going to believe. So what does Jesus do? Beat him up for that? Nope. Because Jesus knows the human mind is to see and then believe. He goes to Thomas, gives him a chance to see, and then he turns to Thomas and he says, then Jesus said in John 20:29, you believe because you have seen, Thomas. Good for you. But here's the thing, generations after you, Thomas, are going to be blessed because they're going to believe without seeing me. But Thomas, they're going to see me through what you have seen in me. We're going to tell this story for thousands of years. And based on what you experienced, based on what you saw, based on what you encountered, there are people who are going to believe. And they're blessed more than you, Thomas, as blessed as you are in this moment. So let's write this down and let's tell people and let them experience it for thousands of years. So what do we do with this? Well, can I give you a simple, practical kind of thing? Why don't you take John's eyewitness account, call it the book of John, the Gospel of John, and don't read it like the Bible. Read it like an eyewitness account. Just sit and live the story, be there with, and watch what might happen as you read it that way and be inspired to grow your faith, not by seeing Jesus, but by experiencing him through what they have seen. And then I would say this, John writes this, not just to give the details. He writes that we would respond in the way he did. I think John desperately wants people to believe what he believed because he saw. And he describes in these potent, picturesque ways of what he saw and what he experienced. So you and I would have the response that he did. He not only believed, but then he behaved in a way that was a life trusting and restful in Jesus. And he dies this content old man, walking faithfully with Jesus through the most challenging times. We're in challenging times. But you know something? If we're waiting to have faith based on what we see Jesus do, that's not quite the kind of faith that generations have laid the path for us. They have faith because of what they didn't see, but believed because others saw it. Maybe we could think about faith and grow in that way, just like our story is. Now, Jesus, you are so compassionate for us human beings who struggle to believe. We're so prone to want to see. And sometimes you do let us see. But more times than not, you let us hear and read and experience what others have seen. And our faith can grow and can be inspired in that way, even during this chaotic, challenging time. It's a blessed faith to believe without seeing. May we be those kinds of people and inspire the world with it. For your fame, Jesus.